I'm going to step off of coupling here because I don't want to have this be something you try to memorize. What I'm going to say is that you start looking at how people move and you start doing evaluations. Focus more on the movement patterns and the logic you can use to kind of figure out where those connection pieces are. Rather than memorizing a few examples, that's not going to benefit you too terribly much. But the determinants of that impact spinal posturing in curves. Where I put pressure in one location is going to impact where I have balances in another. If you increase the lordotic curve, if I increase this, it's going to subsequently, if you think of these three layers, these three areas in the body as gears, if I have one set of gears that's got a concavity to it, this next set of gears is going to have a convexity, and then the cervical spine is going to have a concavity. So if I crank this gear, it's going to rotate this one. So if you increase lumbar lordosis, it's typically going to increase kyphosis here, which is an increase of an outward bending, which is inherently going to increase the lumbar, the lordosis within the cervical spine as well. So where you mess up one of these, you're going to mess up another. That's this concept of coupling. Where rotation is happening laterally, on one side it's going to torque it on the other side as well. So a muscle might fire here, that's triggering one up here. And that's why we start having issues with how complicated this can get. Ligaments. There's a few. Anterior and posterior longitudinal, ligament of flavum, interspinous, intertransverse, and supraspinous. And then we're going to have one more ligament of Nuche, which is my favorite because he's fun. I just like him, so you're going to learn. It's your whiplash ligament, so we'll get to him. All right, so anterior longitudinal associated with intervertebral joints. So this goes from the sacrum all the way up to C2. So this is a massive ligament. The inner fibers of it blend with the annulus fibrosus, so it is distinct, but then again, it runs those fibers, the collagen fibers, in with it, so damage to it can potentially damage disc as well. It's thickest in the lordotic areas, C-spine and lumbar spine. So lordosis and kyphosis, do you know those words? You should from anatomy a long time ago, right? So lordosis is more of a concavity, a bending of an in. Kyphosis is going to be a convexity where it's bowing outwards. Anterior atlantoaxial ligament is a continuation of this first one. It holds the same anterior name, but it's got its own unique little name because it's a little different running up from C2 to the occiput. And you'll find that frequently happens when we're dealing with the spine, is that region by region we'll call things slightly different things, slightly different names. Posterior longitudinal ligament within vertebral canal along posterior surfaces of vertebral body. So your anterior, it's pretty much running along here, the anterior surface. The posterior is going to be running along those vertebral bodies, but on the inside, so it's pretty much the inside of the spinal canal. Make sense? Not trying to trick you. All right, these as well interlace with the annulus fibrosus. They go sacrum to C2 as well. But it provides little support in the lumbar spine, so it's not very strong. Majority of the support in the lumbar spine is going to come from musculature. The tectorial membrane is the continuation of the posterior from C2 to the occiput. So again, we just like calling things unique names. So we have our anterior atlantoaxial and we have our tectorial. In degenerative states, disc degeneration may have significant impacts on ligament function. The ligaments can become slack in neutral position, or the posterior longitudinal becomes taut in extension where it normally would be slack. So if we have degradation of the discs, it could create gaps. And if we normally have a disc that's this fat, and all of a sudden it kind of squishes and it compresses and now it's here, then the ligament that runs across that space is now going to be slack, so it's not going to provide the support that we normally need. Ligamentum flavum, sacrum to C2, is an elastic ligament on the posterior surface of the vertebral canal. So the anterior longitudinal is in the most anterior portion along the front part of the vertebral bodies. The posterior is along the vertebral bodies on the inside of the canal. And so this is going to be on the posterior side of the canal, which kind of runs along the inside of, say, the spinous processes. So inside the canal, inside the spinous processes. It connects the lamina of adjacent vertebrae. Some fibers extend laterally to cover articular capsules of zygapophyseal joints. So fibers here of this massive ligamentous band can actually create the synovial capsules for those inferior and superior articular forceps. And then the posterior axial ligament is the continuation of the ligamentum flavum from C2 to the occiput. Interspinous ligaments, parallel fibers run diagonally and fill space between spinous processes. Convenient name, interspinous ligament to go in between the spinous processes. Supraspinous ligament, supra being out above or outside cord-like structure connecting tips of the spinous processes from C7 all the way down to L3, L4. So interspinous is going to be in between the spinous processes, and the supraspinous is going to run over the top, over the outside at tips. And then we get ligamentum nuchae, which is the same idea of the supraspinous ligament, but it's going from C7 to the occiput. So it fills in a pretty massive stretch from C7 to here in pretty much a straight line. So this whole open area right here is filled in by the ligamentum nuchae as it fills in that whole space. So you take somebody in a car wreck, whips the head forward, and the ligamentum nuchae is pretty much the ligament you're hurting, along with a lot of muscles, and damaging the cervical spine. Fun, fun. And then intertransverse ligaments, very highly variable from region to region, and they go between the transverse processes. And they kind of flow in with the lumbar musculature. Resist lateral bending on contralateral side. What else do I want to do today? A lot of that you've seen, so we're pretty good there. See, there's a picture of ligamentum nuchae, just so you can see it pretty well. So here's your interspinous ligaments here, and then ligamentum nuchae fills in that space all on the outside tips of the edge from occiput down to C7.
Are you going to put this one back together?
Absolutely.
And this for 30 down?
What's that?
30 down?
This will be for the final. Yeah, so the information we have from this point on, this information is going into the final exam. And as we start focusing